Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Aaron Guest. I'm a Redlands resident and a volunteer with Accelerate Neighborhood Climate Action, better known as ANCA. This is our 6th event in our Resilient Living series. Through these monthly Resilient Living talks, we hope to provide how-to workshops to better equip all of us here in Redlands to face severe climate change. I think we can all acknowledge that climate change is real. Just look out, check the weather these days, and realize that it's a major threat to life on Earth. If you're not familiar with ANCA, we're a nonprofit organization originating out of Denver and now based here in Redlands. And our mission is to build community climate resilience by bringing climate action to the neighborhood here in Redlands. And we hope to do that through education and planned events such as this one. We hope you check out our information table over here to the right. The resource table has a lot of great information, further signups. One thing I'd like to highlight right now is our upcoming Earth Day event. This is going to be a community-wide event. It's going to be a day of action. It's going to be the first of its kind here at Redlands. Not only is it going to be a great event and something to connect everybody, it's also, if you sign up, you get a free vegan cake pop. And don't worry, even if you don't sign up, there may be a couple cake pops left over. But I don't know if you want to take that risk. So tonight's event is all about making the shift to a more plant-based diet. And that's one of the most impactful things we can do for both the planet and our own personal health. We'll specifically hear about how a plant-based diet can improve our health, as well as why it's necessary for a sustainable future. We're very happy to have as speakers George Christensen, Michael Polani, and an interactive session facilitated by Mandy Parks and Marilyn Cott. Our first speaker will be George Christensen, MD, who's a clinical professor of psychiatry at Loma Linda University School of Medicine, where he directs the behavioral sciences curriculum. Clinically, he's worked mainly with seriously mentally ill. He's researched brain effects of antipsychotics and also medical students' attitudes towards the mentally ill. He's received numerous teaching awards, including the School of Medicine's Teacher of the Year. His administrative roles have included being medical director at the Loma Linda Behavioral Medicine Center and also of Patton State Hospital. He has an avid interest and has given many talks concerning climate science. Our second speaker is Dr. Michael Polani, who's a doctor of public health, preventive care, and is the director of the graduate program on plant-based nutrition at Loma Linda University School of Public Health. He's the recipient of the Glenn Blix Award for Excellence in Preventive Care and Delta Omega Award. He's taught courses in advanced public health, nutrition, obesity, and disordered eating, nutrition policy programs and services, community nutrition, and nutritional applications and lifestyle intervention. His education and experience focuses heavily on plant-based nutrition and optimizing health and wellness and lowering the risk of chronic diseases. Our third speaker will be Mandy Parks, who will be facilitating an interactive portion and final QA with all the speakers, along with Marilyn Cott. Mandy is an ANCA volunteer, as well as the district manager at the Inland Empire Resource Conservation District, which is a public agency headquartered in Redlands but focusing on open space preservation, wildland rehabilitation, and education and outreach to residents within 1,300 square miles of public and private land in northwestern Riverside and San Bernardino County. She lives in Redlands with her husband and 2 kids, all of which have successfully navigated the transition and many positives towards a more plant-based approach to diet. Our fourth presenter is Marilyn Cott. Marilyn and her husband Jim relocated to Redlands in late 2019 after serving together in the U.S. Air Force for 26 years, and then with the Catholic nonprofit in Brazil for 3 years. She became involved in environmental activity and advocacy at that time and joined ANCA's education committee last fall. Marilyn went on a meat sabbatical in mid-2021 and lives in a household in which much, but not all, of the diet is whole food or plant-based. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, George Christensen.
Thanks, Aaron. There, that's my talk. So I used to joke that a plant-based diet was only eating animals that ate plants. But realistically, what I'm going to be talking about is the kind of diet that's good for the planet. And Michael's going to talk about the kind of diet that's good for you. There's a lot of overlap, but I can tell you, I am not a vegetarian. I have fish or poultry once or twice a week. I have beef and pork maybe once a month. When I want a really good hamburger, which that might be one, I will get it. But the degree of meat intensiveness in my diet is the kind of diet we want people to move toward. You don't have to go totally vegetarian to be good for the planet. So let me just tell you a little bit about why. Now, before we get into the details of animal agriculture and why that's hard on the planet, I need to give you some definitions. So, 1 gigaton. This is 1 billion metric tons, 2.2 trillion pounds, 200 million elephants weight, and it equals the mass of all non-human mammals on Earth. It's big. But at the bottom, oops, let me do that. I am giving you an advanced notice of what's coming. So in 2021, greenhouse gas emissions were nearly 41 gigatons, which is mind-blowing when it's a gas, but it's huge. Now, the second term that you need to know is carbon dioxide equivalents, and that's because there's more greenhouse gases than just CO2. And particularly when we're talking about animal agriculture, the other two here become increasingly important, but how do you create an overall measure? And so just for comparison, I really don't like greenhouse gas as a name because it's really a blanket. It keeps the heat in. So if we say CO2 is equivalent to one blanket, it lasts in the atmosphere for 300 to 1,000 years, one blanket. Methane is the equivalent of 100 blankets, but only for 12 years. But of course, if we keep putting methane up there, it lasts a lot longer. And nitrous oxide, yes, laughing gas, is equivalent to 300 blankets, 300 the warming rate of CO2, and lasts for about 114 years. So if something is putting out all three, how do we calculate that? Well, they have equations, which I will not share, to convert that to what they call CO2 equivalents. And as you can see, that's this measure down here. But it just makes things a little easier. We'll be talking about all three of these. The other word I want you to know, I'll figure this out, is eutrophication. This is something you can use at cocktail parties and other places. It literally means from the Greek, well-fed, well-nourished. And the thing that gets well-nourished in this particular example is algae. And so eutrophication, when you hear that, you think of two things: fertilizer and manure, both of which have a lot of nitrogen. They flow into water systems and the ocean. They bloom the algae sucks the oxygen out of the water, and you have dead zones. And we'll come back to this, but the general overall term for that is eutrophication. So, overall, we're going to talk a little bit about all food agriculture and kind of where that sits in terms of the climate change, and then animal agriculture, and then in terms of livestock, and then zoom into cows, because cows have a very special, not in a good way, place in this whole discussion, even compared to all the other meats. So, sorry, I have a lot of graphy kind of things, but bear with me. So, this is greenhouse gas emissions, and food, all agriculture, is about 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions that occur annually. And you can say, well, why are we talking about that? Shouldn't we be talking about this? Well, I can tell you, it's a whole lot easier to change your diet than your energy footprint right now, tomorrow, because you can do it tomorrow. And the diet is the most easily changed and the biggest thing oftentimes most of us can do to address aspects of what's good for the planet. In terms of land use of all the habitable land, half of it is used for agriculture. In terms of use of water, it's 70% of freshwater withdrawals go to agriculture. And in terms of eutrophication, 78% of eutrophication is due to agriculture, both livestock and farming. And again, that's largely due to nitrogen, because what do you get when you go to Home Depot to feed your plants? You get nitrogen. So we'll come back to that a little bit. Now, looking at just the livestock, animal agriculture, animal agriculture is, of that 26%, it's responsible for half of it. When you add up these three. More interestingly, and a little more discouragingly, the big issue that we're going to come back to and back to and back to is animal agriculture is grossly inefficient. And so you put a lot in, but you don't get so much out. And so here we are back again, half of habitable land is agriculture. Of that, 77%, 3/4, goes to livestock. That livestock produces only 18% of global calories and 37% of global protein. This little 23% of crops over here produces 80% of global calories because it's just so much more efficient. And we'll get back to that. I mean, when you think about it, you have to raise the corn and it doesn't go to you, it goes to the cow, which then eats it, and you can see how it gets increasingly inefficient. We'll come back to that. Just to kind of, this blew my mind, I'm so sorry, but it really did. So what have we done to our planet? Well, over here are all mammals, and this is global biomass, which is a technical term basically equivalent to dry weight. 4% of all mammals are wild. That's all that's left. 96% of mammals on Earth are either cattle and pigs or us. And of that, cattle and pigs are the bigger by almost 2 times. That's what lives on our planet. When it comes to birds, which we're not going to focus on all that much, but you can see again, 71% of the biomass of birds on our planet is poultry. And this is stunning. Now, when you actually look at cows, there are nearly a billion cows on our planet right now, and that was 3 years ago. There's probably more. So this is an amazing amount. I mean, cattle agriculture, is just an enormous worldwide phenomenon. As evidenced here. By the way, do you know what country has the most cows? It's the country that doesn't eat them. It's India. And they just milk them and worship them, I guess. But they actually have the most cows. But the second one, which we'll see at the end, is Brazil. Now, cows are special, but not great. Let me show you the ways that cows are special compared to other meat. Now we're moving away from comparing it even to plants. We're just comparing it to other meat. Here, how many kilograms? I did something. Okay, good. How many kilograms of CO2 equivalents does it take to produce 1 kilogram of food? 99.48, basically 100. 100 kilograms of CO2 equivalents are emitted in the process of creating 1 kilogram of beef. And as you can see, it's the winner by far in a race you don't want to win. Lamb is 39.72. Pork, it's a lot different, 12. And poultry, again, a tenth of what beef is. Why is that? I'll tell you, but hold on. Now, even when we move to dairy, Again, cows have a major disadvantage. And this kind of surprised me. I always heard that almond milk, you don't want to drink almond milk because so much water goes into the use of almond milk. Well, look, for dairy milk, to produce 1 liter of milk requires 628 liters of water, easily almost doubling what it takes for almond milk. Now, sure, soy milk is way better, but so even dairy milk is at a disadvantage when it comes, for the planet, when it comes to every category compared to plant-based milks. Energy. This asks the question, what's the percentage of feed feed calories that you put into your animal that actually comes out as product calories? And milk cook is pretty good, it's almost a quarter. Beef, 2%. 2% of the calories you put in come out as actual food. And again, this is strikingly different than the other meats, and then also, of course, plants. And in spite of all of those things, cattle production is the most important, this is what the USDA says, don't take my word for it. The most important agricultural industry in the United States, consistently accounting for the largest share of cash receipts, in spite of all of those things I just showed you. Which also means changing it is going to be opposed, but it's something that we can do as individual consumers, and it's important. Now, the question is, why? In every one of those metrics, beef wasn't just bad, it was way bad compared to the other types of meat. Why is this? Well, there's 5 reasons, and I'll explain it to you. It's pretty simple. They grow slowly, they belch a lot, they eat a lot, they poop a lot, and they take up a whole lot of space. And that's basically the outline for the rest of my talk. So first, they grow slowly. When you look at how long does it go from birth to slaughter, this is, again, I learned a whole lot doing this talk, but look, for chickens, 2 months. For cows, 2 to 3 years. And of course the others are in the middle, but still, even hogs, 6 to 7 months. Way less than this. And during that whole time, they're eating, belching, and pooping, which we're going to get to. But this is a big part of why cattle is so inefficient as a protein source. They also belch a lot. Now, some people think it's farts, but it's not. Methane comes from this side of the cow, and this is why. Cows eat food that is very tough to digest. I don't recommend going out and eating hay, because it won't work for you, but it works for a cow because they have 4 stomachs. And in the first stomach, they have particular ways of digesting that produces a lot of methane. And in fact, they create 1 cow creates 220 pounds of methane per year. Now, just in case you think your housemate might be coming close to that, humans do a 1/4 pounder per year. Another fun fact to share with family and friends. There's more to come, actually. So they belch a lot. They eat a lot. Look at how much they have to eat to produce 1 kilogram of food product. So beef has to eat 25 kilograms of feed, and of course that feed has its own carbon footprint in how it was grown and transported, etc. But they have 25 kilograms, whereas poultry, 3 kilograms to produce a kilogram of food product. Now, this is to feed those 1 billion cows that are on our planet. Takes a tremendous amount of agriculture that's not going to humans, except via cows, which is pretty inefficient. So here, when you look at this is the, in millions of tons, the amount of corn produced annually, and 59% of it goes to cattle. 57% of soy products go to feed cattle. And again, as I mentioned, all of this has its own separate carbon footprint in terms of nitrogen to fertilize and transportation and the machines to harvest, et cetera, et cetera. This is looking at it a little bit different per country, the percent of food grains grown in that country that don't go to humans, that go to animals. And as you can see, Brazil, it's pretty much a 90 to 100%, as in Canada, and Australia, a little bit in between for Russia. So they eat a lot, they belch a lot, and they poop a lot. Another fun fact to share with your friends: how many pounds of manure does a cow produce every single day? Well, it varies a bit, from anywhere from 75 to 100. That's way more than your even biggest dog. So, now the reason this is important, because we talked about carbon dioxide in terms of creating the feed and everything. We talked about methane, which is the belching. Now we're going to talk about nitrogen. And so this manure has to go somewhere. So it's 1 billion cows and 100 pounds per day of manure, and you do the math. I can't, it's too big, my brain breaks. So this is a cow standing by its manure, and so animal production contributes to 37% of methane, again that's the belching pretty much, and 65% of the nitrous oxide global emissions. Now 7% of that is from manure, a lot of it also from fertilizer in their feed, and 44% of that manure comes from cows. Now, in addition to going into the air, as we mentioned before, a much more, in some ways, significant issue is it goes into the water, and it creates the eutrophication, which creates dead zones. This is, in 2017, the largest dead zone ever in the Gulf of Mexico. The North Gulf of Mexico always has a dead zone during part of the year. This is as big. It went all the way from Corpus Christi in Texas to New Orleans over here. It was bigger than many states. Now the red, it means the oxygen level in the water is too low to sustain life. This is a literal dead zone. And this is not the only place it's happening. There are several dead zones, not only in lakes, but also in many places in the world's oceans. So, they belch a lot, they poop a lot, they eat a lot, and they take up a whole lot of space. So this is, again, lamb comes a very close second, but do you think there's a billion lambs on the planet? No. So this is, it's still, beef is the big problem. It takes basically 120 square meters of space to produce 1,000 kilocalories of meat. And again, way more by almost orders of magnitude than the other sources of calories that are listed here. So the question is, if it takes up that much land, and there's a billion of them, where is the land coming from? Well, it's Brazil, and in many ways. So, as I mentioned, India has the biggest cattle herd, but Brazil has the biggest cattle herd for meat production. And if you look at what's happened in Brazil over the last about 40 years, and so this is a graph showing where the land has been increasingly turned over to livestock grazing. In all parts that are non-Amazon, it stayed roughly the same over from 1974 to 2020. But in the Amazon, that's where the land is being cleared for cattle grazing. And what happens when you clear a rainforest? That's deforestation. And so in many ways what we're talking about is not just CO2, but lots of different effects in lots of ways on the planet from this particular meat. In terms of deforestation, it's pretty simple. Living trees, particularly the Amazon, which is an amazing source of biodiversity, and huge trees that suck CO2 out of the air. But if you cut the tree down, it then releases all of that carbon in decay back into the air, and then you put cattle onto the land where all those felled trees are, and now they're releasing methane and nitrous oxide. So this is a very bad equation to go this route. Now, here's a graph that shows you in a bit more dramatic way as well, that in terms of the share of tropical lands deforested for agricultural products, you know, palm oil is a big one, and you'll hear about that. But beef is twice as big. And almost half of land that's being cleared in tropical forests for conversion to pasture land is simply to graze cattle. So the next question is, and this is on closing the talk, is, well, if you change your diet, basically this is asking the impossible hypothetical question that if the entire world changed their diet, what would happen in terms of the kinds of planetary issues we've been talking about? Well, this is one study that asked those scenarios. And so here it asked about global greenhouse gas emissions from food. And it projected over the next 80 years. And it said, this is what would happen if nothing changes. And then what if we increase the yield? What if we cut food waste in half? What if we kind of made it a little more healthy or improve farm practices? Clearly, the most effect is switching to a plant-rich diet. This is not vegetarian in this particular study. This is a diet that was designed by people in the British medical journal Lancet, and it was nearly half a reduction, more than any others. The most important thing here is simply remember who we're giving the planet to. And of all the things that you can do right now, tomorrow, you can begin to start switching to less and less and less meat, and in particular, less and less and less beef, and encouraging others to as well. It's not a hard thing. The diet is still pretty good, and Michael's going to tell you how it's so much good for you and not just the planet. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me okay? Mm-hmm. All right. So let me make sure I can get the IT stuff to work. Okay. So what I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about are looking at sort of the health benefits of really different forms of plant-based diets. So if you take a look at the outline that I put together, we'll start off talking about what are some of the trends when we're talking about plant-based foods and plant-based dietary consumption, really here in the United States and really worldwide as well. We'll talk a little bit about what are some of the reasons or motivations for why people tend to incorporate more plant-based foods. And then we'll get into sort of what some of the research has shown as far as plant-based diets and how that affects risk for chronic diseases, okay? Particularly paying attention to the ones that happen to affect a large proportion of the population here in the United States. So your heart disease, your cancer, your risk for diabetes, weight management problems, obesity, which a lot of times for some people as they get older, they tend to have to deal with a number of chronic health problems, okay? We'll also talk a little bit about the effectiveness and really the appropriateness of plant-based diets on different life stages. So for younger individuals, infants, children, how does it work, and is it appropriate for pregnant women during the gestational and lactation period, as well as for older adults. And then we'll just spend a couple minutes talking about the important nutrients of concern to focus on for a plant-based diet, and what are some of the key recommendations for a plant-based diet as well. Okay. So when we look at some of the trends, and this is looking, if you take a look at the top, we're talking about sort of from a global perspective. They found from recent looking at vegetarian diet, how it varies by country, they found that approximately 10% of the population, on average, consumes a vegetarian diet. And here in the United States, when they've looked at certain polls and surveys, they found that those percentages have been a little bit lower than that. Now, those are really just asking people, do you consume a vegetarian diet or do you consume a vegan diet? But what they're really not looking at is, are people tending to consume more plant-based foods or replacing animal-based products with more plant-based foods, which we know tends to be healthier and more nutrient-dense, okay? So when they've looked at the marketing trends, they've shown that there has been a significant increase in people wanting to consume more alternative plant-based products like dairy products. We know that as opposed to cow's milk, a lot of people are consuming, soy milk, rice milk, oat milk, okay, which varies as far as the amount of calories. Sometimes the proportion of nutrients varies as well. Also looking at the trends when we're talking about alternative meat products. So not those that are coming from cows, but those that are from, fermented soybeans, chickpeas, textured vegetable proteins, for instance, okay? Those are becoming a larger proportion of the market, and you can see that the money that they're getting from those are estimated to be in the billions. They're actually approximating that, for instance, alternative dairy products is expected to reach close to 25 billion with a B, within the next few years. The other thing I just wanted to mention, when they looked at the 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines for Americans, they've really focused on more, not just healthy foods and healthy nutrients for the average American, but also looked at what are some examples of healthy dietary patterns. And they do recommend the healthy vegetarian diet as an example of a healthy diet to reduce risk for various health problems, chronic diseases, okay? And really a lot of other countries, even though the recommendations from other countries when we're talking about dietary guidelines are a little bit different, even other countries are now focusing more on plant-based foods, like legumes, beans, peas, lentils, fruits, vegetables, and nuts as well. And just if you're curious, what are some of the other dietary patterns that have been recommended? In addition to the healthy vegetarian diet, they've really recommended what we call the healthy US diet, focusing on healthy sources of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, protein, and dairy. And then the other one is the healthy Mediterranean diet, focused on things like not just fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, but healthy sources of fat, and even moderation with things like olive oil, healthy fish in moderation as well, okay? Now, if we take a look at sort of the reasons or the motivations for why people have been focused more on plant-based diets recently, you can see those are listed here, things like health. A lot of times when someone may have a heart attack or they get diagnosed with a certain condition, sometimes people are more likely to want to incorporate more vegetarian or plant-based dietary options, okay? Other reasons that was presented in the previous PowerPoint, sustainability, climate change, the benefits of plant-based foods for reasons of sustainability, and also when it comes to the welfare of animals as well, okay? Now the other thing I just wanted to mention on this slide is a plant-based diet does not need to be exclusively plant-based diet, okay? It can consist of most plant-based foods, or in some cases, like for instance, a vegan diet, it's basically exclusively plant-based foods. So no meat, no animal products, no dairy, no egg. But there are sort of middle ground or middle areas where you have things like your semi-vegetarians, pesco-vegetarians, those who may consume some animal products, okay, but may focus a lot of times on more plant-based foods and plant-based nutrients to incorporate a healthier diet, okay? Now, if we take a look at what the research has shown when we talk about plant-based diets and risk for chronic disease, if we take a look at cardiovascular disease, there has been a lot of studies, both observational studies and even some clinical studies where they've looked at different types of dietary interventions that have shown that plant-based diets, those that focus on things like whole grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, have shown reduced risk both for incidence of cardiovascular disease and heart disease mortality, okay? And this is based on reduction in a lot of these what we call modifiable risk factors, okay, associated with not just heart disease, but other chronic diseases as well, okay? Things like body mass index, okay, height adjusted weight, waist circumference, which is important when looking at things like the amount of visceral or abdominal fat associated with a lot of chronic health problems as well. Same thing with lipoprotein concentrations, your total, your LDL, your triglycerides, and also things like blood glucose, inflammation, and blood pressure. So these are really a lot of the underlying risk factors for a lot of chronic, preventable metabolic health problems for a lot of individuals here in the United States, which does tend to vary according to things like diet and lifestyle, okay? Now, what they found from certain intervention studies, when they looked at certain plant-based diets like a vegan or even a vegetarian diet, especially one that's low in fat, that's been effective in actually reversing incidence of coronary artery disease in those who have heart disease. Now, that's important because it shows that a plant-based diet may be effective in not just preventing or lowering the risk for heart disease, it may actually be effective as well in trying to treat and manage people who have heart disease as well, okay? And part of that is based on the nutrient content, has more fiber, plant-based nutrients, obviously less saturated fat and cholesterol. You may have heard of what we call the Adventist Health Studies, which Loma Linda University has been involved with for a number of years. Basically, it's a prospective study looking at different aspects of the Adventist lifestyle. For instance, the vegetarian diet. And they have found that a vegetarian diet is associated with lower risk for heart disease compared with non-vegetarians. The other one, the EPIC Oxford, where they're looking at adults in Europe, have also found that vegetarians, vegans, and health-conscious individuals reported reduced risk of heart disease comparing vegetarians and non-vegetarians, in which those who focused on a plant-based diet had about 30% lower risk of heart disease, okay? Now, when we look at the association between plant-based diets and type 2 diabetes, both based on research from observational studies as well as clinical trials where they've compared different types of dietary interventions, say from a plant-based diet versus a control group, they have shown a lot of benefits in reducing risk for type 2 diabetes for those who focus on a plant-based diet. Now, one of the reasons why they suspect that is because when you focus on a plant-based diet, again, a healthy, nutrient-dense plant-based diet with more fiber, vitamins, and minerals, you'll see that it doesn't affect or spike the blood sugar as much for people suffering from this condition, okay? In other words, healthy plant-based foods tend to have a lower glycemic index. That's what they're referring to. In addition to that, they have found from a lot of studies, plant-based diets can help with a lot of factors associated with both emotional and physical well-being, okay? For instance, things like depression, quality of life. Even when they look at the direct effects on blood sugar, the plant-based diets, again, healthy plant-based diets, help with maintaining lower levels of A1C and also lowering things like overall weight and cholesterol level. And what you can see here is that compared to most Western diets, those that focus more on a plant-based diet, whether it's vegetarian or strict vegan, okay, they're normally higher in a lot of the healthy nutrients that is associated with reduced risk for this condition. And you can see why those who practice a plant-based diet normally are at lower risk for diabetes, as well as other conditions like heart disease, proper weight management, and even cancer, as we'll see in just a minute. On the other hand, what they've looked at through various studies is that when they've looked at the impact of meat, okay, particularly red meat and processed meat, increased intake of red and processed meat was associated with increased risk for type 2 diabetes. Now, on the other hand, when they replace animal protein, say from red meat or processed meat, and they replace it with plant-based protein, say from legumes, beans, peas, and lentils, they see the opposite effect, where it leads to a lower risk based on lowering your A1C, your fasting blood sugar, and also your fasting insulin level, okay? So sort of that combined effect, when you replace the calories in your diet with more animal products, such as meat, with more plant-based foods, okay? Speaking of cancer, one of the benefits of plant-based foods is that it has a number of what we call protective plant-based chemicals. They refer to those as phytochemicals, okay? There's actually a lot of research being done on what are the direct effects of these phytochemicals on lowering the risk for cancer, okay? So whether it comes to the effects of things like nuts, almonds, walnuts, peanuts, for instance, or whether they're looking at specific things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, okay? Even higher intake of legumes has been associated with lower risk of various forms of cancer, okay? And on the other hand, if you take a look at the bottom of this slide, increased intake of both red meat, whether it's beef, lamb, or pork, or increased intake of processed meat, say from like deli meat, sausage, bacon, those types of foods, both of them have been associated with higher risk of various forms of cancer, okay? So this again illustrates that if you're able to replace a lot of the animal protein, the red and processed meats, with healthy plant-based foods, there is an overall reduced risk of various forms of cancer, heart disease, and maintaining normal blood sugar levels, okay? Now, a lot of these conditions are associated, or people are at higher risk for these conditions when they do happen to gain weight, or they're at risk for overweight or obesity, okay? So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the effect of plant-based foods on risk for unhealthy weight gain, or obesity as they call it, okay? What they've shown from observational studies and intervention studies is that when people focus more on healthy plant-based foods, whether it's vegetarians or vegan diets, they have been associated with lower BMI, and that's helped to protect against weight gain to reduce risk of becoming overweight or obese, okay? Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is when we say plant-based diet, it should be foods that are healthy and nutrient dense. The foods that have more fiber, vitamins, and minerals, one of the reasons why they're associated more with proper weight management, when you eat more fiber and healthy protein, like plant-based protein, it does provide more of a sense of satiety. It keeps you full for longer periods throughout the day, both between meals and a lot of times even when you are eating a particular meal. In fact, they've shown from studies that when somebody eats, say, a high-fiber pre-meal snack, say 20 minutes before a meal, a lot of times that keeps them full for a longer period, so they tend to eat a lower amount of calories when they do eat that particular meal or throughout the day, okay? So this is one of the ways that healthy, high-fiber plant-based foods can help to reduce risk for obesity, okay? But it is also important to keep in mind that diet quality may in fact be more important than just, say, a dietary pattern. Because in fact, someone who says, I'm eating a vegetarian diet may not always necessarily be eating a healthy diet, okay? Especially if they're consuming a lot of sugar, refined grains, unhealthy fats. It's not meat or animal products, but it can still affect their risk for possible health complications, okay? So plant diet, but healthy plant-based diet is both important for reducing health risk, okay? Now, a couple of things I just wanted to mention regarding plant-based diets in different life stage groups is that research has shown that a healthy plant-based diet is perfectly appropriate for meeting the energy and nutrient needs for a pregnant woman, okay? Assuming they have access to healthy food, okay, and they're consuming a healthy diet and maintaining and monitoring their weight during the 9-month gestational period, they have shown that that's led to both healthy infant growth and development. The mothers have been able to provide nutritionally adequate breast milk, okay? They've also shown that dietary patterns high in plant foods are associated with reduced risk of things like gestational diabetes, okay, or even problems associated with hypertension during the gestational period. These are problems, or these are conditions that are normally screened for, usually during the mid-pregnancy period. They often check the blood sugar, maybe around 20 weeks of gestation. And healthy plant-based foods can also reduce the risk for the baby being born premature, which can also lead to other possible complications, okay? Couple things to keep in mind though. Vegetarians do need to make sure that they're getting adequate sources of these specific nutrients. And they point out a couple ones here, things like your iron, your B12, okay? Some of your healthy fats and iodine. In most cases, if the mother is focusing on a healthy, balanced, plant-based diet, usually they are getting adequate amounts of iron, or of these nutrients. So for instance, iron may not be from meat sources, but they can get them from a lot of other plant-based foods as well, okay? For infants and children, they've shown similar trend where children who focus on vegetarian and vegan diets still tend to be nutritionally adequate to promote adequate development for the child as well as for an adolescent as well, okay? So the health benefits by having the parents and the caregivers expose the children to a wide variety of plant-based foods can help to reduce their risk for complications like childhood obesity, for instance, or problems with blood pressure or possible diabetes. It's also important during this time period to incorporate healthy eating habits for the child, because this is the time, especially during that early elementary school period, when children tend to develop their eating habits. So developing and incorporating healthy eating habits is very important, because a lot of times if a child becomes, or maybe develops bad eating habits or picky eating, those are the types of behaviors that can be very difficult to change or modify as they get older, okay? So this is the time when a lot of times children can be more impressionable, okay? To open to healthy eating habits, okay? The other thing I mentioned here at the bottom is the nutrients that require special attention, making sure that they're getting adequate amounts of these particular nutrients, like your iron, your zinc, okay? Those two are especially important during the initial infancy period when children are incorporating complementary foods after they've been exclusively breastfeeding or on formula milk, making sure that they get iron or zinc fortified foods. Same thing with like calcium and vitamin D. And if they're vegetarian, you can get a lot of these foods from healthy plant-based food sources, okay? The last one here is older adults. Now, the one thing about older adults is as individuals reach, say, that 50, 60 years of age, the energy and calorie needs tend to go down, okay? And that's true for a number of reasons. Older adults, a lot of times, are maybe less physically active. Their metabolism starts to slow down based on changes in their, body composition, have a little bit lower lean body mass. So they normally don't burn as many calories as breast and don't require as many calories. Now, having said that, the nutrient requirements for a lot of vitamins and minerals among older adults is either the same as when they were younger, or in some cases may be higher. But the good thing is a well-planned, well-balanced plant-based or vegetarian diet can still meet all of these nutrient needs, okay? For instance, higher protein foods like soy products, okay, legumes, nuts, seeds, alternative meat products can be incorporated by older vegetarians to get all their nutrients and amino acids as they get older, okay? A couple things to keep in mind, like for instance, vitamin B6 recommendations for older adults sometimes are a little higher because of decreased absorption and changes in the metabolism of this nutrient. But again, a healthy vegetarian diet usually incorporates adequate vitamin B6. Same thing with vitamin B12. Part of the reason for increased vitamin B12 needs for older adults, especially for the older vegetarians, is because changes in the GI tract can impact the absorption of this particular vitamin, okay? Not to mention a lot of times for older adults, there's a decreased secretion of stomach acid, so that can lead to reduced B12 absorption, in which case either B12 fortified foods or possible supplementation may be needed, okay? And this last couple slides are just what are some important nutrients of concern for a plant-based diet. So for instance, for calcium, which we know is important for healthy bone, healthy teeth, you can get them not just from your dairy products, okay? These are examples of plant-based sources of these important nutrients for people who want to focus on a plant-based diet, okay? You can get a lot of these from your leafy greens. You can get them from things like almonds, fortified milk products. We know that iron you can get not necessarily from your red meat, which is your heme source of iron, but even legumes, leafy greens, even things like quinoa, those are your non-heme sources of iron to reduce risk of anemia, okay, both for children and adults. Same thing with zinc, you can get those from a lot of plant-based products, legumes, soy products, nuts, even iodine, you can get those from iodized salt as well, okay? And here you're just basically looking at the other important nutrients of concern, vitamin B12, like I mentioned, fortified foods, possibly through supplementation. Vitamin D, a lot of times individuals may either need supplementation, even though you can get vitamin D from sunlight. Usually for a lot of people it's not enough exposure to get sufficient vitamin D. So either fortified food or fortified milks or supplementation is normally recommended. Okay. Omega-3 fats, you can get those from a lot of different types of nuts and seeds like chia, flaxseed, or walnuts. And then protein, for a vegetarian who's practicing a plant-based diet, it's important that they incorporate a variety of plant-based foods in their diet, okay, to make sure that they're getting all of the essential nutrients and essential amino acids, okay? And this is just a look at, sort of from a pyramid perspective, what a whole food plant-based diet should look at. So in other words, what should the composition of the diet be for someone who chooses to incorporate more of a vegetarian or a plant-based diet? Obviously, it should consist of things like fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, okay? And at the top there, they have things like high-fat whole foods. Those are foods that are still healthy for the body, but because they do tend to have more fat and calories, even though it's healthy fat, that's where moderation with some of these foods still becomes important, like nuts, almonds, those kinds of things, okay? And this is something that's called the food triangle, okay? So when thinking about trying to focus more on a plant-based diet, but also try to meet and not exceed your calorie needs, if you take a look at the top here, you have what are considered the plant-based foods that are fairly low in calories. So those are your leafy green vegetables, those are things like your mushrooms, your what do they call them? The stems, the bulbs. Those tend to be very low in calories, so you can consume them in a lot higher quantity. And as you're increasing your calories, or increasing your calorie density, you want to focus more on healthy plant-based foods, like for instance, healthy fats, nuts and seeds, and healthy sources of carbs, like your starchy vegetables, your legumes, beets, peas, and lentils. And that's where consuming the animal foods more in moderation, or cutting down on excessive consumption of animal foods, becomes very important. Okay? And then the last thing I just wanted to mention, this is what we call the daily three. So one way to try to think about and focus on eating a healthy, balanced, plant-based diet to also lower your risk for certain chronic diseases are to focus on these types of food items. So for instance, your 3 servings of leafy green vegetables, 3 servings of fruits, 3 servings of legumes like beans, peas, and lentils. Looking at other types of colored vegetables, at least 3 servings in which the different colors represent the different nutrients that's important for a healthy, balanced diet. And also 3 servings of nuts or seeds, and also making sure that you're getting enough exercise throughout the day as well. Okay? And that, I think that was it, yeah. So that was the end of the presentation, so thank you guys very much.
Okay, can everyone hear me in the back?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mandy. I'm with the Inland Empire Resource Conservation District. I'm talking tonight with Marilyn Cott. We're going to kind of get through these slides quickly so we can get to the Q&A part of the evening. But just overall, we're talking, kind of building off the first 2 presentations and talking more about how to transition, how to actually incorporate a lot of the information you've heard here tonight. So quickly, Michael actually just touched on this a little bit. It gets a little confusing to think about what does plant-based mean. There are so many terms, it means so many things to so many different people. And I think when you kind of look at this chart, it's pretty simplified, but really does get you to think about where are you on that chart, where do you want to be on that chart. Both speakers made really good points about this not being an extreme talk tonight. It's not a message that you have to go home and never eat meat again, certainly not. But it does, I think, offer up kind of an opportunity to get your eyes on where you are now and where you'd like to be, because that obviously is going to really impact kind of your next steps in trying to actually start implementing. So in doing a little research, just on what exactly I was going to talk about tonight, I found some funny things online that, Homer Simpson would be a vegetarian if making your own trees. That made me laugh, broccoli versus cauliflower, and then broccoli versus a burger. We've also got a lot of positive trends in veganism, vegetarianism, plant-based diets. There are things like Veganuary. It's an annual event. It's put on by a nonprofit based in London, actually, and in the last year the data was available, they had more than 400,000 people sign up to do this month-long, just plant-based kind of trial run. I was talking to Marilyn earlier, and she said I think she'd done a meat blitz in 2021. This is maybe kind of dipping your toe in, seeing if you like it, how implementable it is in your life. It's also obviously much easier to travel these days. There's a lot of resources, information, on how to eat plant-based when you're maybe not right at home in your comfort zone. And then for anybody that's been plant-based for a long time, it's much easier to find a variety in every store to kind of supplement, keep things interesting and not boring. There's also mixed data, mixed kind of trends in vegetarianism and veganism that overall kind of seeing a decline, but an increase in the United States in terms of people adopting a plant-based diet. And then you also have a much higher percentage of people that identify as former vegetarian than current practitioners. But the really good news is even people that kind of go back and become flexitarian, maintain this kind of fluidity in the sort of lifestyle they're practicing, really never go back to their original meat levels, and so, or animal product levels. So you're still seeing climate benefits, health benefits that we talked about earlier, no matter what lifestyle you're choosing. So the most important thing to think about when you're transitioning is it's certainly not impossible. Planning and support is critical, and really thinking about your why. What is the biggest motivating factor, and how you can transition that into kind of using it to guide the way that you move forward, to make sure that your choice becomes sustainable, and you are able to adopt this in the long term. So very brief background. I've been a vegetarian since I was 26. Don't ask me how many years that is. And it actually was since a class I took at the University of Redlands on ethics in the environment. Was just some really kind of shocking imagery, really shocked me into changing the way I ate for different reasons. Many years later, I'm still a vegetarian, but it has a lot to do with climate these days, as much as it has to do with animal welfare. My husband started transitioning around 2010. He already wasn't eating fish, but more because he's picky, not because he was doing it for ethical reasons, and already wasn't eating pork. But over time, he removed beef, then chicken and turkey, and kind of used this process that I've heard people call 4 legs to 2 legs to no legs, which is just a nice way of saying, it's kind of funny to think about it. But the way to think about it is it's a slow transition. It's adopting practices, making it implementable, and not kind of throwing everything out all at once. He's gotten better over time, and now it's routine. Then I put up a picture of my kids. I was really glad to hear a lot of what Michael was talking about earlier. Many people in my life didn't think it was wise to go through a pregnancy vegetarian and have vegetarian children. Side note, that's Crater Lake, if anyone's never been there. I went there last summer, it's incredible. But they are really, really healthy. We try to keep it simple. We do things like eat the rainbow, which is another thing Michael was talking about. So at least 3 cups a day of talk about color on their plate. They're always monitoring color on their plate. We also make sure they're eating iron regularly, talk to their doctor, and then, vegetarian kids eat garbage too. There are vegetarian chicken nuggets, just like there are regular chicken nuggets. But it's certainly a lifestyle that can become part of your daily life. For them, it's very normal. It's not strange at all. And then this is kind of one of the most important things. I referenced this earlier, is the why. And so one of the things to think about is 100 grams of beans versus 100 grams of beef. There's really no comparison protein-wise. They're somewhat similar, but otherwise beans beats protein in every other category. They are significantly higher in fiber, iron, calcium. For anybody concerned about climate, there's far less water, obviously. There's no comparison in terms of cost, and this all sounds good on paper, but then you start thinking about eating a bowl of beans, at a restaurant or going to, somebody's house, and maybe, I think that's where transitioning to this kind of a lifestyle gets a little bit daunting, and you start thinking about if it's really possible or not. And so thinking about your why makes this really critical. One solution to this, if your why is about sustainability, is the Impossible Burger. Really nutritionally, it's not, Michael might argue with me, he probably knows a lot more than I do about this, but really it's not that different. One is not necessarily a ton healthier than the other for your body, but Impossibles are far more sustainable. Thinking about how much food we have to produce over the next 40 years to meet the insane population projection, it really does make sense to choose this, that it requires 96% less land, 87% less water, produces 89% fewer emissions. So again, that's the importance of figuring out the why. Are you doing it exclusively for diet and your body? Then an Impossible really isn't any better than your hamburger. But if you have other reasons, that's definitely something that becomes a sustainable choice. You can find it out in places. People, may or may not have it when you visit their homes. And then thinking about that diagram I had up at the beginning of the talk, just kind of looking at where do you want to be on that diagram, where are you now, and where, what direction do you want to move in. So just thinking about transitioning to lower meat consumption, less animal products. You see there's so many resources, it's almost overwhelming. But it's very easy to do these. These are the top 3 things I always tell people if they ask. I don't go around lecturing people talking about it. If somebody asks me or someone asks me about the kids, don't feel pressured to give up everything. Start with what you already eat and focus on changing the easiest meal of the day. So looking at reading, thinking about your why is really critical, but it's also becoming familiar with recipes, slowly incorporating those into your weekly grocery routine in a way that feels sustainable so that you don't challenge yourself to go fully vegan in a single week. Instead, slowly replacing meat-centered menus to less and even no meat, one meal or more a week. And then changing the easiest meal for a lot of people is breakfast. It's a really simple way to do it. And then when you're out of the house, when you're with friends, when it becomes harder to stick to plant-based, that becomes, the time that you eat meat, you become kind of flexitarian. And then we're back to our legs example. But thinking about a plant-based diet and what that means, 4 to 2, seafood, dairy, a big part of plant-based is eliminating processed food, and then being able to call yourself fully plant-based. No matter what you're looking at doing on this diagram, the idea is looking at the frequency, thinking about where you are now and where you would like to be in a month, in 2 months, in 6 months, and starting replacing, allowing yourself, I guess what would be called an indulgence, or sticking with the things that you really, really continue to enjoy. But trying to make progress so that every month it's becoming easier and easier to incorporate these things into your diet. And in both this slide and the last slide, the biggest predictor of success, I think for anybody, in sticking to this transition, not excessive planning unless you're somebody who really enjoys that, but easy things, looking up a menu before you visit a restaurant, checking in with the host before attending a function, not arriving starving somewhere when you're unsure of what will be served. I recently went to New Orleans where being a vegetarian was not the easiest thing. It really was got a little difficult, but a little planning made it accessible, and it's something that I think everybody can do as you get used to navigating, hopefully for you, an increasingly meatless world. So, Marilyn.
Okay, so thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight. And I thought I would just give a quick testimonial before I move on to a few slides that I wanted to share with you all, because so much of this has kind of brought my experience up here. So as mentioned earlier, a little over a year and a half ago, I decided, okay, I'll try a meat sabbatical. And how I got there was probably 20 years ago or so ago. The animal compassion thing kind of came up. It's not, I don't think it's immoral to eat animals, but kind of how you treat them in the food chain was important to me. So I had noticed that, and I would probably say I was a reducitarian at that time, but I was probably convinced that I could always find humane meat or that I couldn't nutrition myself without it. So then fast forward several years, and I sort of decided that the environment was something I wanted to advocate for, and I really came on strongest in the zero waste side when I sort of was horrified at what packaging, all sorts of packaging, but is doing to our world and to the future. I really just took a good look at my habits, and so trying to be a zero waste food shopper is not easy, you all know that. So then on top of that, I heard the vegetarian drumbeat and vegan drumbeat a lot harder And so I started to realize the water and the energy involved in meat and really in seafood too. So all of that ended up to, as mentioned, just a little bit under 2 years ago, me deciding to quit meat and quit seafood. So I still eat dairy and I still eat eggs. But being the zero waste first, I guess having really noticed zero waste first, I asked if I could speak just a little bit about maybe not just the no meat and no seafood side of shopping for groceries, but maybe I could introduce a few ideas if you have, you've probably noticed these, but if not, maybe this will help. So, you know, and George mentioned a lot of things about, one of his early slides said that within the US, greenhouse gas emissions account for manufacturing and transportation, which I would say means in the food business, processing food and transporting food counts for 51% of our greenhouse gases. So I think that's also a place where we can all help overall with the environment. So if you look at transportation and packaging, I think if you simplify that, if a person is able to simplify, you just reduce so many different things that are affecting our world these days. So for example, when I go to the grocery store and I decide to buy pasta, then I can buy pasta from Italy, which Italy's a great place, I love Italians, or I can buy pasta that was made right here in the US, and it probably had to travel from the Midwest to get to me, but it didn't have to come all the way from Italy. And so there's one less ship out there that's going to run into the whales or put diesel fuel into the ocean and raise the temperature of the water. If I look for things from the Pacific, I can probably find them right here in California. A lot of them made right here in California, if not in the Midwest. And then again, they didn't have to get on a boat or an airplane and fly into Los Angeles or Long Beach. Same thing, this was a real bummer for me when I started noticing how much fruit came from Latin America. And so I try to stick with what's in season and what's local to here. And one really great thing in the grocery stores these days, a lot of times the produce will tell you exactly where it came from. So, well, not exactly, but it might say the state, it will say the nation that it came from. So just my small short pitch was to consider fresh local foods, consider staples that are from the US, and organic and less wrapped, less packaged items. And that in a lot of ways points you towards whole foods. You end up eating a lot of whole foods. And beverages can be a really easy place to start. So for example, if you brew your own iced tea instead of buying the stuff that somebody brewed for you, or maybe Coca-Cola, then it didn't have to get on a truck, and all that liquid weighs a lot, and now the truck is crossing the Rocky Mountains to get to us, and maybe it didn't have to do that if I just got water out of my tap and threw in some iced tea bags or lemon to make lemonade. There's some lemons back here if you want some. Okay. I noticed in the store, you know, when I was a kid growing up, you made orange juice out of, well, if you lived in California, you made it out of oranges, or you ate orange, that's a good idea too, or you made it out of this concentrate stuff. But now at the supermarket, you almost always find these huge plastic, zero waste alert, bottles with orange juice, and the orange juice comes to us from Florida. And then this picture up here on the right, which you probably can't read, so I'll just tell you what's on it. On the back of this plastic bottle that got shipped all the way across from Florida to us here in California so we could avoid eating fresh oranges off our own trees. The fruit, some of it came from Brazil. So oranges came from Brazil, got combined with oranges from Florida, or maybe California, who knows? It got manufactured in Florida and then traveled to California. It just doesn't seem right to me. Oops, that was a little judgmental. Sorry about that. Okay, we all probably know about water in plastic bottles. It's not good for you. It's not good for the environment. So please, if you haven't thought about it before, try the tap. And then again, just whole food, plant-based. You can buy a lot of stuff in bulk, which allows you to not take plastic bags. And again, when stuff is packaged in bulk, you might get 10 apples when you really only needed 4. And you know, you try to eat them all, but 2 of them end up well, hopefully in the compost bin. So again, it was unnecessary transportation, water, and fuel. Okay, that was my not quick enough pitch, but thank you.
to Marilyn's point, if you're not enjoying Redlands oranges, you're not doing it right. So let's give a big hand to our speakers. We don't have a lot of time, but I'd like to invite them up here to take some questions from the audience. Then we're going to do final announcements, a quick raffle, and then maybe a handful of minutes if you want to stick around. We will discuss sort of your own personal tips with your neighbors. So we can invite our speakers up, and if you have a question, I think we have another microphone here, or maybe Mandy, you could sort of facilitate and repeat the question. So do we have any questions for our speakers?
Yes.
If not, we have more questions.
I'm just wondering, has there been any research looking at diets and dementia in seniors or Alzheimer's in seniors? Because I know for a lot of me and my friends, that's a big topic, and that influences a lot of what we do.
Can you take that?
Well, I know that Loma Linda, and I don't know if you could answer this better than me, they do have research where they're looking at different neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's. I don't think that they're directly looking at dietary factors, although there are some dietary recommendations about more focused on whole foods, less intake of a lot of the, I think, saturated fats, unhealthy processed foods can help with some of the prevent neurological breakdown. But I don't know if they've done a lot of recent clinical trials, like randomized controlled trials, looking directly at a particular dietary, like plant-based diet, say at Alzheimer's per se.
There is research for the turmeric or the Alzheimer from the Molina.
What?
Turmeric.
Turmeric.
Yeah, there is a research.
Right, I was going to mention that, yeah. There is a somewhat lower incidence of Alzheimer's in India, particularly where a lot of turmeric is consumed, and there are research at UCLA that is looking at that. But also you have to realize that there's more than one kind of dementia. And there's Alzheimer's dementia, which still remains a big puzzle, but there's also dementia from multiple strokes. And so food that reduces the degree to which you have inflammation and atherosclerosis reduces your risk of stroke. That food is plant-based. And so we may not be able to knock down the risk of Alzheimer's yet too much, but you can reduce the risk of stroke-based dementia.
Yes, go ahead.
There's some doctors at Loma Linda that came to Loma Linda. I said, why did you leave San Diego or the beach area to come to Loma Linda? They said they're doing a study on Alzheimer's and different dementias. And it's Dr. Sherfside, husband and wife team. And they've written some books, and I got the book.
There's a lot of people that learn.
Big place.
Yes.
Well, Mandy, has your kids ever had a real hamburger?
They have not. They did. I let them play next door. This was pre-COVID, and our neighbor didn't know they were vegetarian and did feed them raw chicken nuggets. And when they came back, we talked about it, and they told me how good they were. And I was like, I know that. I know they're good. That's real. That's it. That's the only time. As far as I know, I don't know if my in-laws are keeping anything for me, but as far as I know, that's
I
it.
think that would be very hard to keep them away from going with their friends to McDonald's.
You know, it's because since they were born, you know, it's totally normal. Yeah.
I don't know if anybody noticed the recent irony in the Redlands Daily Facts. There was a blip about this event tonight. And right above it, there was an article that said, Redlands residents celebrate the arrival of an In-N-Out burger. Like 3 days ago. Does anybody want to address the devastating effects of the fast food industry? Not just the food and the way it's fattened our children, but the massive amounts of solid waste they produce. Is this a lost cause, or what? Does anybody think about this?
Yes.
I don't know data, but I did look into plastics and plastic effects on human bodies, and certainly, you know, a huge contributor, just the plastics, as you said, is takeout containers and the waste in fast food restaurants. And, you know, it is part of an entire culture right now that we have where we're not really factoring that in. And you walk into Costco and just notice the plastics by itself. But I think that the concern I have about the fast food industry, in addition, is that it becomes an inexpensive way to get a lot of calories. And I worry about lower income folks gravitating toward that kind of unhealthy, not just unhealthy, but also wasteful diet, because it's easy to get high calories at low cost.
Can I just say two quick, okay.
So thank you for that question, and this might not answer directly, but there's something called the Break Free from Plastics Act that they keep trying to bring up in Congress, and so please go Google it, or we'll send it to you or something. It might not do much, but at least one letter or email from you to the senators and the congressmen might help get it started again. So that would be kind of a national level. There are some equivalents at different states trying to make manufacturers responsible for the whole plastic chain, and so at least increase the cost of plastic so that it's less attractive. But the other thing is maybe locally, I've never tried this yet, but there are municipalities where it's discouraged, and I don't think it is in Redlands at all. Every time a new business opens up, it's just, you know, Katie bar the door on the styrofoam and the packaging. And so there are restaurants and places where you can take out in containers that are compostable, but it's a choice of the restaurant. And just real quick, one more thing, sorry. California AB 619, which was passed and went into effect right before COVID, allows you to take your own takeout container into a restaurant and put your leftovers in there instead of taking home.
When did that come in?
3 years ago. Unfortunately, COVID hit, and so, but it's still in effect. So you can take your own in, and I would just recommend being polite to the waitress and saying, oh, I don't need that, I have a container already. And if they give you any guff about health, just say, it's the California law. Please, you know, tell your manager to look it up.